I wanted to maybe take a step back and just kind of ask maybe a question that sounds really simple. I'm sorry if this is a really basic question, but we've talked about a lot of different things. We've talked about the sort of leverage areas. We've talked about worker agency, corporate accountability. We haven't talked as much about safer migration, but I know you mentioned that is a sort of leverage area that's emerged amidst this pandemic. But how does all of this relate to forced labor and human trafficking? I think for most people, maybe that term in general, or those terms, forced labor and human trafficking, they evoke, a certain kind of image or a certain kind of situation. Whereas I think our conversation today, we've talked about all kinds of challenges within the supply chain and some, talked a lot about the solutions, but we haven't really painted a picture of what forced labor and human trafficking means today. And, the real problems we're addressing, for people to understand why these issues are need to be worked on.
Yeah, so I think your point is super solid in that, thinking about what really is forced labor. I think what we see in the news is often, villains of brands that are doing one thing, but then we also have this idea of more of an informal sector. That's where people are ending up in these situations of forced labor. But I'll go back to the ILL definition of forced labor, and it's all work or service which is exacted from any person under the threat of a penalty and for which the person has not offered himself or herself voluntarily. So it's pretty, it's pretty wide. It kind of goes back to the situation of is someone understanding the working conditions that they're going into, and the ones that were promised, are they being delivered on? And that takes really so many different forms. For me, one of the most surprising areas that I just didn't know much about was that area of safer migration, where individuals would end up paying for their jobs and go into debt for many years. Most folks go abroad to work so that way they can earn extra money and send it back to home. But when there's a situation of being in debt for many years before you can even do that, it doesn't make sense. And many workers don't know that exists. So one of our grantees is called BPL. It's a social enterprise that was started by BRAC in Bangladesh.
Right.
And so that program essentially seeks to provide options and different pathways to migrate and seek work abroad, but to do it in a way that is at cost, not with exorbitant fees from middlemen. And then also that includes this component of education, where there are classes that the workers take so they can understand the calculus of how much money is going in and out, what are the commitments, how long will you be abroad, and what can you expect, which is just missing from most of those other channels for migration. So it's wild to think about the different forms that this can take. Within the supply chains of companies that we interact with so often.
Yeah, companies that maybe, we consume from and we're familiar with. Yeah, no, I think, as supply chains have become, more global and more complex, more globalized, complex supply chains have led to a lot of issues that now we're in a position where we need to address and unravel. And I think the complexity of it all can make it challenging in a way that, it's not necessarily that this was created by design, but it's just the forces that drove these situations, weren't checked at the right time. So, I think from what, on the topic of safer migration, it sounds like one of the one of the key interventions here is around awareness and information and kind of interacting with workers themselves, either through different agencies or different tools. And so could you talk a little bit about, either some companies or some tools that you think are doing good work in this area, or in general, some approaches that you think have been really effective in addressing, safe migration?
Yeah. So it's been really interesting. When we had the innovation fund, we were looking for different kinds of tools that were scalable, that could potentially have business models around them so that they would have sustainable funding and not just rely on philanthropy. And it was very, very hard to find any of these either companies that are providing those methods for migration, or even tools that could provide that awareness. We've grown to learn that there's a challenge because this business of sending people from one point to another, it has such low margins. And so already workers are paying fees often to cover the costs of doing that business.
Sure.
And so when there's many different brands that are making employer pays commitments, and gathering with groups like the Responsible Business Alliance and engaging, there's a group called the Leadership Group that is trying to have companies that are all committed to this have employer pays and ethical recruitment practices. It is very hard to find companies that are actually doing that. And so it's been a real challenge for us. And right now, one of the projects we're working on is actually a exploration of financial mechanisms to go to recruiters essentially and say, how can better behavior be incentivized? Is it a challenge to cover your costs? So would different kinds of access to financing persuade you to not take those different fees at different levels? So right now we're working with Social Finance UK to look at the potential for different kinds of financial mechanisms. Initially we were thinking of social impact bond, but now it might be some type of blended finance model. So yeah, it's really like a nascent market, if you will.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's definitely some exciting like beacons of hope that are popping up, BRAC BPL being one of them. But yeah, the relationships for the sending and receiving countries, and then also just the mechanics of the actual business models are something that are always in flux. So it'll be interesting to see how COVID continues to affect that calculus going forward.
So when you do talk about sort of ethical recruitment and even, in general, all the different things we've talked about today, we mentioned tools that can address these problems. And when you say that, do you mean kind of organizations that come in and help regulate, build systems and all of that? Or are we actually talking about tools in the form of technologies and solutions and innovations in that regard?
Yeah, it's kind of all of the above.
Okay.
Some of the tools that we have in our portfolio are really interesting. SMS applications. There are other online platforms that workers can use. And then also others are just informal networks of migrants, for instance. There's one called Shramik Sanjal, which is it's a network of workers. And through those channels of conversation, they're able to get things done and support each other in a way that using a cell phone just doesn't allow you to do. So I think it depends on the context, but I've been really excited by a few of our tech providers. I should say I've been excited by a few of our the companies that are building technological solutions.
Sure.
One of them, two examples I should give of companies that have been used in during the pandemic. One is called Maya, and it is an application where workers in garment factories can go online and see different kinds of information about doctors, access to health information, which obviously became really popular during COVID, and they had overwhelming response. They can also access different kinds of legal information and labor rights information. And so that platform, which originally may have just been used to say, hey, I have an infection, where can I go to get it treated, became a really big source of two-way conversation between workers and different sources about COVID and COVID infection rates and whatnot. The other one is called Gramvani, which is popular in India, and they create essentially like radio channels that you call into and listen to. And because it is a platform that's run in the Hindi language, workers who speak that language, who are migrating all over the country, are all able to tune in and get information about different kinds of labor rights issues and ways to access government support when there are instances of forced labor or exploitation. So yeah, they saw so much increased demand through the pandemic, especially as migration and work was shut down. So just really excited about the power of something like a technological platform that could reach workers during a time of the pandemic when everything is all movement is shut down.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we observed, in the garment factories that Good Business Lab sort of does research and projects in, that a lot of the sort of traditional in-person programs, whether they're trainings or any kind of worker well-being programs that were traditionally done in person, those were the first programs during this pandemic to sort of be put on hold because, just the risks associated with them. But then when you had these digital tools, things like what you're referring to, those largely were uninterrupted and in fact became way more popular, as a means to kind of stay connected throughout all of these, moments of isolation and confusion. So it is really cool to see technology being leveraged in the right way. And I think you mentioned something earlier, which I think is important to highlight, and it's that there's so much innovation and so much thinking going into solving problems in areas where that are where there's, I guess you could say, a profit motive, where there's an opportunity to make profit out of. But then when you look at these particular labor intensive kind of low wage sort of businesses, there's not really the same type of energy or the same type of innovation, or it appears like that there's not. But then when you hear about some of the things, the companies you mentioned, it's really encouraging to see that same spirit of innovation being applied, in these supply chains where the impacts can be huge. And I think, we've seen through our work that obviously the social impacts can be huge, but even for firms, even with low income or low wage workers, there is a cost to recruitment. So for example, going back to the ethical recruitment topic, when you're thinking about why an agency that's providing labor to a company, their costs, their margins are so small, but at the same time, there's definitely costs associated with attrition and with kind of having to kind of replace workers who quit and so on. So I wonder how much of those costs are being accounted for And if you're able to actually see all of the costs of these, outcomes, whether it's low productivity, whether it's sort of, attrition in general, then would that motivate businesses to take more ownership over solving these problems?
Definitely. Yeah, I think the tools that we've had as business leaders for the past few decades, they're no longer relevant in some cases, and we need new ways of measuring success, of happiness, of feeling content, and for instance, and really accounting for all those costs, like you said, both like direct and indirect, and even how do you account for stress, or the impact of remittances. It's just, there's so many different factors that don't go into traditional public company accounting, that I do think there is more discourse around now.
Sure.
But it's very slow to change the way people view them, because of the incentives that are in place to kind of continue with the status quo. So I do hope that some things like the pandemic are shedding light to the need to see things differently, and do business differently, because at the end of the day, caring for workers is super important to everyone in that ecosystem.
That's right. Yeah, we have at Good Business Lab a slogan: worker well-being is good business. And I think now, we've talked about this as a team, but it's more and more becoming obvious that that's true, because even if you look at the example of go back a few months when factories were reopening, and they needed to protect the health of their workers just to remain open. So the well-being of your workers was essential for you to even run your operations. And I think just from that point of view, it's interesting to see how the climate has changed so much. But I think, it's highlighting things that have always been true, but just made them, way more obvious.